Good evening, everybody. You're very welcome to this Athletics Ireland webinar this evening. My name is Anna Grealish and I am the Women in Sport lead for Athletics Ireland. This webinar is part of a series that we're having this month all around health and wellbeing for women. I'm delighted this evening to be joined by Sharon Madigan, who's going to give us a talk this evening on REDS, or Relative Energy Deficiency Syndrome in Sport. Sharon is the Head of Performance and Nutrition at the Institute and is also the Science Lead for Team Ireland. So we're delighted to have Sharon here with us this evening. We're also going to hear from one of our Inspire ambassadors at the end of Sharon's presentation to talk about her own experiences with REDS. And if you have any questions for Sharon, you can pop them in the Q&A there, and I will ask her at the end of the presentation. And if you have any questions, as I said, just pop them in the Q&A there. So we're delighted to have so many people sign up for the webinar and join us this evening. As I said, I'm Anna Grealish and I'm the Women in Sport lead for Athletics Ireland. And this is the first of our series of webinars this month looking at health and wellbeing for Women in Sport Month. So I'm going to hand over to Sharon, who's going to go through her presentation. And as I said, any questions, pop them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we can ask Sharon there at the end. So you're very welcome, Sharon, and looking forward to hearing your talk this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I'm just going to share my screen here. Hopefully it'll happen relatively quickly. We okay on that? Yeah. Great stuff. Thank you, Anna. Thanks everybody for coming along tonight. Some of you may have heard presentations I've done before in this area, some may not. Hopefully, even if you have, this is an opportunity to take away something new and maybe be able to apply it or reflect on things that you might have done previously as well. So basically what I will do as well is I will share some resources that we have with Anna that can be shared out and sent out maybe along with the presentation as well that we've developed within the Institute. It's a kind of an area that I've had a long-standing interest in. We were lucky enough to get funding back in 2016 or 2015 to do some research in this area, which we've actually been able to develop quite a lot of work within. So this is just an example of a couple of the infographics that we have. And again, some of the idea is that can you relate to any of these particular feelings or situations, because they might be some of the things that might indicate that there's a bit of a mismatch in terms of energy availability. And this is what it kind of comes down to, is making sure that there's enough energy in the pot for the work that's been done. And quite a lot of us nowadays, I mean, there's a very big kind of a movement in general public that a lot of us are consuming too many calories, which is not wrong. And another word for energy is actually calories. But the difficulty is when you have training loads that are quite significant, it becomes very easy to run into tricky situations around making sure that you're managing energy in and energy out. And there's lots of reasons for that, and we'll talk about them after a while. What I suppose we want to be able to look at is maybe some shorter term strategies and some longer term strategies. And some people on this presentation tonight, I mean, will not have experienced any of it, but it's just been aware of some of the things that can maybe change relatively quickly that can cause a mismatch and cause difficulties. And in terms of what you guys as athletes, what you guys as coaches want, parents want, we clearly want that performance element of things, which allows a training adaptation. And when we get that, we hopefully then get our competition performance as well. And injury and illness are really not some of the factors that we want to see. And fundamentally, this was and currently still is the reason that we do see a lot of athletes presenting with illness and injury, is we have to fundamentally look at the bedrock of what they're doing, because it's maybe not supporting all the physiological pots that there are. And I suppose this would be a question that I would ask you if I was in the room with you. Why do we think that this fueling tightrope is really tricky? Well, I think the messaging around fueling, and certainly from, you know, an athletics point of view, is around possibly things like body composition and physicality. And I think there is a certain fear factor when it comes to food in terms of eating too much. But what I would say is that the most important word in the whole element of things is context. And I think the context for the information that is going out to the general public is very different to the information that, as athletes training significant amounts of kilometers every week in the gym, maybe younger athletes doing second sports, all of these things can have a big impact in terms of the context and what the requirements are. And I mean, I would be really critical of us labeling foods. Certainly, we do know that there are foods maybe that most of us should eat less of, but realistically, the context is really important here. And what I mean by that is a bony stress fracture is not healthy. Somebody getting sick in terms of immunity issues all of the time is not healthy. And a girl or a woman without a period is not healthy. So that is the context of which we're going to frame this, not in terms of longer term health and well-being. Now, I would say that actually it is directly linked, because obviously if we're significantly impacting our bones at a younger age, that is going to have some long-term health consequences. We'll talk about some of the side effects of energy availability, and actually one of them is raised lipids and an elevated cholesterol, and actually that can cause longer-term impacts as well. What I would say, and when I look at food intakes of athletes who are in this particular situation, I have no issue with their micronutrient intakes. They are generally eating lots of very colorful, healthy foods, which we would say are termed this healthy. But the difficulty is that those foods tend to be relatively low in calories or in energy. So whereas you're meeting your vitamin and mineral requirements potentially in the main, maybe not for calcium and iron because they're closely linked to energy, but you're generally meeting the requirements for lots of these other ones. And in fact, you can be overreaching in certain nutrients such as fiber, which then has a knock-on effect on appetite and also gut and bowel health as well. So somebody having bloating, wind, diarrhea, constipation, because they're consuming far too much fiber in an attempt to be healthy, I don't think that's healthy. So we've got to put this all in that space of context, which is really important. And I mean, what I would say in terms of, you know, again, sugar is something that has been definitely given something that is not good for us. And I would say we go back to that general public piece, and most of us are consuming too much sugar. The interesting thing for me is actually what the dental health is issues, and we've got a dental health project ongoing as well, you know, to try and minimize the impact of some of the advice that we're giving athletes around refined sugars, refined carbohydrates in an attempt to meet their energy requirements. But what you have to look at as well is if you look at a lot of the products and foods that say they're sugar-free, particularly things like bars or and they're a good example. A lot of those particular products, if you look at the ingredients list, I mean, there's just so many ingredients in there, half of which I can't spell. I don't know what they are, and I have a background in biochemistry. And also what they do is to make sure that something can be termed sugar-free on the label. What they actually do is add these polyols or sugar alcohols into products, xylitol, mannitol, sorbitol. And what they do is they can actually cause significant issues with people's guts, so that they then end up with significant side effects there as well. So it is very important that we look again at the context of what we're trying to do. And again, a lot of this comes in, again, trying to put things into either good or bad categories. and one size doesn't fit all, and we have to look at the context in terms of what people are doing. And I mean, this is one of my favorite slides, if you can read it, but it says lead uranium, and cocaine are also gluten-free. A lot of products now have what we know as a health halo. So if you add protein to something, it's automatically healthier. If you make something sugar-free, it's automatically healthier. If you have something that's gluten-free, it's apparently automatically healthier. So again, we just need to be mindful about the context in which marketing terminology is used and whether or not that's actually suitable for what we're actually trying to do. So if we come back to this energy equation and the calories that we're looking for, we are looking for energy balance. And this is very difficult because there is an assumption that what goes in has to come out. And I'm going to show you a diagram in a little while to show you that it's not just quite that simple. And again, we do need to use calories for all of our bodily functions. And where we start to run into trouble is when there's not enough left over to cover the cost of the physiological functions after you take away the exercise or the training load. And these are some of the negative impacts that we can see of long-term energy imbalance, of which none of them really are things that we would be too keen on having. So low energy availability is definitely linked to amenorrhea, which is loss of the menstrual cycle, and osteopenia, and further down the line into things like osteoporosis, or maybe as we previously had known it, which is the female athlete triad, which tended to be, I suppose, focused towards eating disorders. And we can get low energy availability without an eating disorder. A drop in metabolic rate and reduced thyroid function. So what happens is when there's not enough fuel coming into the tank to run the individual, systems actually start to slow down and to just try and preserve energy as well. So actually what we do is we see changes in thyroid function and the metabolic rate shifting a little bit too. And these would be some of the tests we would look at in terms of trying to get a wider picture of what's happening there. Risk of injury. So again, if people's presenting with regular injuries, and that's some of the work that we saw from Danielle Logue's PhD a number of years ago, where we questioned 1,000 women in Ireland around their history of injury, and we saw that around about 40% of them were having significant blocks of time, up to about 3 weeks in a year, where they were injured and not able to train. We see abnormal bloods and we see increased sickness, particularly upper respiratory tract infections. Now, that can be because the immune system's not getting enough of the right type of fuel, particularly carbohydrate, or it can be because there's low iron stores, because that can then trigger impacts in terms of your immune system as well. We get changes in cardiovascular function, where we're changing low blood pressure, low pulse, hypoglycemia. We see gastrointestinal symptoms. So again, when I'm looking at questions around a female where I suspect maybe the input versus the output, there's a mismatch, I will ask a number of different questions. I will look and ask about menstrual cycle. I will ask about their history of injury, what's that been like? And I will also ask questions around gut. So do you have bloating? Do you have wind? Do you have constipation? Do you have diarrhea? Do you have both? And quite often you see that in there as well. Because remember, the gut is one of those physiological pots that needs to get fuel as well. And if there's not enough fuel coming in to cover the cost, then that's one of the areas that actually can slow down as well. We see changes in lipids, where we get an elevation in cholesterol. And again, this evidence comes significantly from the eating disorder, anorexia nervosa patient population, where there's not enough fuel in the tank to cover the cost of what is happening. So the liver releases cholesterol into the system to try and give the system some energy. And what that does is it drives up our blood lipid levels then of cholesterol. We also see other things that are very kind of nondescript, changes in sleep, fatigue levels, underperformance, per form, per mood, and linked into things like depression as well. But a lot of that can be linked to other things. So not necessarily something that would be flagged immediately. So these are some of the other things that are going on there as well. And as I said, it's not just as simple as calories in and calories out. This is the kind of basically kind of response that a lot of our systems have, when it comes to relative energy deficiency in sport. And this is actually simplified, would you believe it? So it can act in terms of impacting sleep. It can act in terms of some of our metabolic hormones. It can definitely impact our thyroid function. It reduces metabolic rate. It definitely has impacts on the female sex hormones. It increases cortisol levels, which can have an impact on immunity and actually on bone formation as well, because high levels of cortisol can block calcium absorption. So this is a really complex piece of responses that are going on there. And this is important to remember because this takes a little bit of time to get right once an athlete has gone down the line of trying to rectify this. And this is really important to remember because sometimes getting this right takes a little bit of time and it doesn't happen overnight. And a lot of people, human nature is that when we make a change to something, we want to see the responses tomorrow or the next day. So quite often some of these changes take a wee bit of time. And what happens is that time then might cause athletes to wobble a little bit and really not to grasp the nettle fully in terms of making the changes over a prolonged period of time. And I mean, low energy availability is really what it is. There's not enough energy available to do the things that we need to do. And I mean, the risk factors for it are a couple of different reasons. It can be unintentional. So the volume of training may increase quite significantly very quickly, or an athlete can decide to add in an extra session just for the sake of it. Or training load is going up and the intensity is going up as well. It could be misguided, but intentional. So again, controlling body weight without disordered eating, not really understanding how that works, but assuming eat less, change body weight, good result, run faster. And then it can actually be down that compulsive element of things where there is some signs of clinical eating disorders, and they can go from anything from just small changes, avoiding eating, maybe putting in some fasting where it's not needed, right up to including things like a scenario called orthorexia, which is an unhealthy obsession with healthy eating, right up to anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa and everything in between. So there are lots of different factors in there as well. In terms of the LEA, what we're looking at is basically the exercise and the healthy functions of daily living. There's not enough energy coming in to support this particular area, so we get a mismatch there as well. And what happens is in energy availability issues, we then start to get impaired health and performance. And actually, that can be on a number of different levels. It can be different with different people, and it doesn't necessarily form or take a linear route. So again, there can be lots of things coming in and out at various different points in time that can actually change that as well. And what we're looking at it here, and hopefully you can see my cursor here, but this is our fuel tank. This is our training. And these are just some of the physiological pots that we have here. I've got general health here, bone health, immunity. I could have sex hormones. I could have hormones generally, I could have bloods, I could have soft tissue, I could have gut. We have all of these things going on in between or behind the level of the skin. We can't see it, we can't feel it, but we just know that it's going on here. And what we have to remember is that when I would ask people what they think the fuel goes to cover first, a lot of people sometimes say, well, a little bit goes into everything, or they might pick general health. But actually, training or locomotion is where fuel is distributed first. And that's what you have to remember. So if you do 2 sessions in a day or 2 sessions in a relatively short period of time, which we'll look at in a minute, then what happens is that increases the cost overall. And what you're hoping is that you've put in enough to cover the cost of the training and also to cover the cost of all these other things that are going on. Now, training load goes up, and people might say, well, actually, that doesn't happen, but it's very easily done, and we'll show you that in a minute. And if fuel stays the same, or actually maybe in some circumstances decreases because people have less time, there's more training, they don't feel they have an appetite, they feel sick, they don't like to run on a full stomach, they like to wait a little bit of time, they're doing another session, they catch up with some friends, they miss out on things. You can see how very easily we get this mismatch. And then what happens is, number one, there's not enough to go into these particular pots. And actually, secondly, some of the reserves that these pots have might have to go in to support this. And this is, people say to me, well, which one of those happens to me? Everybody's very different. Some people lose a tiny little amount out of all of these for a long period of time. And then some people have an Achilles heel, for example, their immune system is lowered and they're the ones that are getting sniffles and colds and coughs all the time as well. And the reasons again, again, we have this higher energy expenditure versus intake, which can have an unintentional, so as we said, it can be intentional or unintentional. Basically, timing can be a problem there in terms of not enough going in over a period of time. And again, we have higher risk periods when it comes to individuals being more at risk of this. Transitioning through school, different schools, maybe leaving school and going to college, maybe exam time when there's other pressures there as well. Changes to home life. So again, we may be leaving home and going to live in halls, or there may be changes to work environments and you're moving. We can have increases in training volume and load and poor or under recovery, or you could change your training group and that can impact it as well. For example, we have athletes that go to training camps either for warm weather or altitude. So again, there would be a higher cost for training there as well. And again, we may have a condensed racing season where we have back-to-back racing weeks. We might have races of an evening now come the lighter nights, and then we might have another race or a park run at the weekend. So there's lots of things that can increase our risk around some of these things as well. So again, misguided weight management is really important, and then it causes this myriad of effects there as well. And what we've seen by the literature in terms of females, that we have really around about a 1 in 4 chance of females losing their menstrual cycle. RED-S isn't an eating disorder, it's an impaired ability of your physiology to function properly. And again, it's caused by mismatching our energy intake over generally a prolonged period of time. Now, that's not to say that eating disorders don't exist there, but again, some of the traits around this are things like perfectionist type thing, black and white thinking, not living in a gray area because they think things are healthy or not healthy. And again, we bring it back to that word of context, which is really important. And what we do know is that if you are a female and you have lost your menstrual cycle due to this, you have a higher risk of having an injury, and also you have a higher risk of a higher body fat composition. So you're not getting the best returns in terms of your physicality for the work that you're doing and what you're eating. So we see that quite significantly as well. Again, I mean, we're seeing a lot more evidence of this in the literature, not only in terms of the scientific literature, but we're also seeing it now across social media with athletes coming out around things that, you know, they have done and maybe just realize going forward when they've reflected back, or maybe just very toxic environments which have led to choices around foods or under eating or under fueling, because there's been really kind of a misguided messaging around some of this as well. And the performance impact really, which is something that we don't want. I mean, fundamentally, if I just take the menstrual cycle piece there, and we have a change in menstrual cycle, that means that the female hormones such as estrogen and progesterone, they are reducing. And the reality is that estrogen and progesterone are really important. They are our anabolic hormones, and they have massive physiological impacts in terms of how we return the work that we're doing. But we get a reduced training response, we get decreased muscle strength, we get a higher risk of injury, we get decreased endurance performance, poor concentration, low mood, decreased, I can't speak here at the moment, coordination, low training availability because people are sick or injured, low glycogen stores, so they're not getting value for money out of the training. So all of these things really are massively important when it comes to performance, never mind the health element of things. But I mean, this is really, you're starting behind the curve when it comes to, you know, the impact of it as well. You know, other things which could be our early detectors: lower motivation, disturbed sleep, increased anxiety, increased or early fatigue, poor concentration, increased irritability. We've heard of that thing called hangry before as well. And I mean, this is just an example, and obviously we're not using the whole amount of oil here, but this is what around about 4,000 calories looks like in the day. Now, people might say, oh, that's massive, I don't need that. I mean, it's the amount of athletes that I know that need anything between 4, 5, 6, 7,000 calories a day, depending on their load and depending on the volume of work in a period of time, is really, really crucial. And you can see here, I mean, we've counted, there's 3, 4, 5, 6, you know, 7, 8, 9 bananas. I mean, some of this, because again, if we look at this and we are picking foods that are very much around, now one of this is to make actually banana bread. So we would have that banana bread and add that in, but there's significant amounts of fiber in that volume of food there. And again, if we're looking at our, you know, racing strategy, we need to look at, you know, the day before racing and what we're doing. And again, the fundamental priorities for most athletes should be carbohydrate. We should not be using protein bars, protein shakes. It needs to be a combination of carbohydrate and protein. But in the environment that you're training in, calories are king and carbohydrate is queen. So we're looking at breakfast, we're looking at snack, we're looking at lunch, another snack, and again, we have then maybe dinner, and then we have again a pre-bed snack as well. So you can see that it's relatively frequently, and we may be using foods that, you know, people perceive maybe as not as healthy, but these are important because the volume of fiber has a big impact on things. I was speaking to a runner today who I had asked to increase, you know, for example, her breakfast, and she'd 40 grams of porridge. But when she actually increased that to 60 grams, she found that she had to wait a bit of time before she could go to run, and actually it kept her full for longer. So what we had to do was look at maybe using some porridge, but also maybe using something like cornflakes or Rice Krispies, who people might perceive as healthy. But what the issue there is that you can eat cornflakes and Rice Krispies because it's like eating fresh air. So it's not going to have the same impact on how you feel And also, you're going to be able to eat more relatively quickly after that as well, which is important. And then again, race day strategy. If your race is going to be later in the evening, we may be looking at, putting earlier pre-match meal and a bigger one earlier in the day. And then we focus on some smaller bits and pieces around that. And then we're going for our dinner and pre-bed, then having something then again. So it's making sure that you're front loading the day and you front loaded the day before there as well. And what I want to show you, and this is a really simple strategy for most of you guys to do, I want you to look at when your pressure points are in the week. And if I was to look at this individual here, I would say that there's two specific pressure points here as a starting point. If we look from 9 o'clock on Saturday to 11 o'clock on Sunday, this person has done two of their biggest blocks of work. Now, I don't have it here, but this individual went in, fasted to this particular session here, and again, only had a very small breakfast before this particular session. They had their dinner around about 6:30 here. So that meant that they were fasting from 6:30 here till about 10:30, 11 o'clock on the Saturday. Now, the problem that we have here is that when you, as well as having eyes on this particular training session here, we must have eyes on this as well, because if we don't, other sessions are going to be impacted. And what I used to ask this particular individual was, I believe that these sessions here on a Tuesday was the one that was going to be impacted significantly. And that's the case because there wasn't enough money going into the bank. So the period of time there is important, but we also have to look at the Sunday into Monday, because there's no magic switch, folks, at 12 midnight every night that makes us ready to go again. And there's no overriding switch on a Sunday night that means we're ready to go for the next week. And this is where the body keeps score, and this is where we run into trouble. So if we take from 9 a.m. on Sunday to about 8 a.m. on Monday, which is 23 hours, this individual has done their long run, and then they've done a run and a gym session. So they've done both of those in 23 hours. This individual had their dinner. They had a big roast dinner, probably here, and then they had a smaller snack of pancakes and fruit and honey and stuff like that. But it was very early. And then they were fasted going into this session here, which is an absolute disaster, because that means they're probably below the curve after this session. So we're now certainly going to be way below the curve going into this. And this is where we eat into those physiological functions, which then is where the body keeps score. So for me, this particular individual had a number of, if we take from 6:30 a.m. on a Monday to 2 o'clock on a Tuesday, we've done 1, 2, 3 big sessions. She is also doing non-training activity as well, such as walking home from work, but that still has a cost. And if there's no money in the bank, then those walks, those recovery runs, those other things that you probably don't even think about, they are actually having a big impact on the overall amount of calories that you need in either a 23-hour period, a 36-hour period, or a 25-hour period. So does that make sense around looking at periods of time as well as days of the week? Because that can have a significant impact at certain phases during the week as well. So what are the barriers really that we need to really try and have a look at? High intensity exercise has an acute suppressive effect on appetite. And what that means is we generally, after hard training, don't feel like eating. And in fact, some of us can feel nauseous and some others may actually throw up. So it's really important that we don't use our appetite as our driver to whether that we eat or not. So, for example, it's really important that this individual does not go into these sessions fasted, because it's very hard to get ahead of that. And it's really important to put food in as soon as possible, because you're thinking about the next session. So this is one of the things that we have to look at. Increased energy expenditure due to high intensity exercise usually can mean that there's no real increase in hunger or energy intake over 24 or 48 hours. So it means that we keep doing the same things. And that's a question I would always ask you. Do you train the same way every day? No, for example, here, you don't. But this individual, when I looked at their food diary, they tended to eat the same way every day. So there's automatically where your mismatch is going to happen. So we really have to look at the periods of time rather than the days of the week. Lack of time, so you're scheduling, going from work, school, college, straight into a training session, maybe haven't had just a small lunch. And it may be that they're the days where you actually try and front load your day, so that we're looking at a bigger breakfast on those days, because that might be part of your recovery from the night before as well. And they're the days where we may look at what I would call a double dinner. So we have a dinner-sized lunch, and we also have a dinner-sized dinner. Now, that dinner-sized dinner might be split into 2 meals, pre and post the evening session, but all of your feeding opportunities, you're looking at what you're about to do immediately, what you're about to do in the next 24, 48 hours, and what you've just done. That's how we try and match it up, rather than going, oh, I'm not training as hard today, therefore I don't need to eat as much. That doesn't work, and that fundamentally catches people out as well. Inadequate meal frequency, sticking to 3 main meals a day, no snacking opportunities, and really assuming that that's going to cut the mustard. So when you follow patterns like that, you tend to just about be able to cover the cost of your physical activity. You don't tend to be able to cover the cost of what you've just done. Low energy density foods, and what I mean by that is high volumes of salads, fruit, higher fiber, and again, what we would have in that kind of health halo type of things. You know, I would see things like porridge with high amounts of seeds, maybe some berries, and so on and so forth. And what you can have is a meal in that actually will keep you full for hours and hours, but you don't want to feel full. You need to be able to take on board more calories to cover the cost of what you're doing. So generally what I see from food diaries is people that are eating lots of very colorful, and I mean, you see this on, you know, Instagram and social media. I see lots of people posting beautiful, you know, salad bowls. They've just run 10 miles and they've consumed maybe 250 or 300 calories. There's very little carbohydrate there. There's lots of micronutrients there, but no energy to cover the cost of what they've just done. So it is important that we look at some of these barriers. Again, if you're feeling sick, if you do not like to go running on a full stomach, looking at options such as liquids as opposed to solids. And again, this is where we reduce potentially the fiber intake. So we take the pressure off the guts, and we don't feel that bloating, wind, some of these other things that we start to get in there. Because, I mean, if you're putting high levels of fiber into your gut has to work much harder. And what happens is, because all the oxygen is going to your limbs to do your workout, there's less oxygen there for digestion. So that's what causes some of the difficulties around that as well. So some of the key points, I mean, I would say context is the most important word around here. What is the context of what you're trying to do? Are you reflecting and maybe finding that there are some of these symptoms here? And if there are, I would be really looking at some of the pillars of how you're going about things, because sometimes It's small mismatches over a long period of time that starts to catch people out. And food is our fuel. I mean, if we're running vast amounts of miles or kilometers every week and training huge hours, food isn't the enemy. And in fact, not enough of it is going to be the enemy in terms of injury and sickness as well. So it's really important there. So I think I've probably finished a couple of minutes quicker than I thought. But I think what that does is it allows us more question time.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Sharon. I must say there's some really interesting things in there. I think particularly around looking at your training week and where your heavy kind of training days are, and actually planning your food and your nutrition around that, because I think that's something that a lot of people don't actually think
Yeah.
about
I
in
mean,
terms of that bigger picture.
that pen and paper exercise, picking out where your pressure points in your week, you might not get it all right all at once. But even if you pick out where the big heavy blocks are and really try and work on that, you will find then that other training sessions will really benefit from that. And a question I would ask people is, do you go out and some sessions you're flying, you're really having a great run, it feels good, and the next day or a day later, you're flat, it's not really a good session, heavy legged, all of these things. I mean, that doesn't come from lack of fitness. That comes from just not looking at what you've just done. And it's really, really important. And I think you can get real value for money there relatively quickly as well. The other thing I would also suggest reflecting on is, do you find that after you do some sessions that you're really very sore? Well, then that is a factor where there's definitely not enough carbohydrate going in. And what you've done is you've had to break down muscle mass to cover the cost of what you're doing. And that then, so the muscle is sent to the liver to be converted into carbohydrate. So it's a really inefficient way of working. And actually, you're sore, then it takes you a couple of days to recover from that. And then your subsequent sessions are impacted as well.
Yeah, exactly. What I might do is introduce Sophie, who's joined us here. Well, if anyone does have any questions for Sharon, have a think about them, pop them in the chat box. I do have a couple here that I'll ask her after we've chatted to Sophie. But Sophie, if you want to unmute yourself there. So I'd like to welcome Sophie Moroney. Sophie is one of our Inspire ambassadors for our Women in Sport program this year, and she's kindly agreed to come on and talk about her own experiences with RED. So Sophie is a member of Emerald AC, and you're at the University of Limerick as well, Sophie, isn't it? So I suppose just to outline, I suppose your experience around maybe what Sharon's talked about there, or and maybe any lessons you've learned from your own training or whatever around REDS or around eating and kind of training and fueling would be great to share with everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I think Sharon covered quite a lot of it, but I'll just kind of explain my story and kind of how I kind of fell into it. So I'm 24 now, so in the summer of like 2018, so I was still a junior athlete. So doing kind of minimal training, and I kind of just made an intention to myself. I was like, right, we're just gonna get good at running here. And of course, kind of way I went about it was like, right, we're gonna lose a bit of weight, increase the training. So again, at two ends of the scale, we kind of were tipping away at. So I kind of just increased my training volume quite a lot, like what I wasn't used to, and kind of intentionally cut my calories. I wouldn't say food, I was still eating like 3 meals a day and snacks, but the energy density was definitely quite low in them. So that kind of went on for a few weeks, and I was like, started to see some signs by running improving, and I was like, hey, this is great. And I kind of fell in a spiral, and I kind of kept going. But initially I lost my period within 2 to 3 weeks, and I kind of put it down to coming off the pill at the start, and went to doctors, all that kind of stuff. And again, doctors were just, you're training, you're an athlete. So I kind of continued on with that for months. And I'd say after 3 to 4 months, I kind of was seeing a lot of the red flags that kind of Sharon spoke about there. Just tiredness, couldn't complete sessions, couldn't even just get through a week of training. I'd go out on a long run 2 miles in, and you just be tired and just couldn't keep going. I kind of just kept going at it. Like, you'd get a few days here and there that, your runs were okay, but it kind of kept going until the new year, then I would say, and the red flags were kind of getting a lot worse. So I was just kind of showing up to training, being tired, telling my coach this. Um, and I just kind of didn't know where to go with it. So luckily, my coach at the time was a woman, so I'd say she kind of could have seen the signs, and she actually put me in touch with Jenny Higgins. I think she's on here actually. I just seen her. So Jenny was actually doing research in this area at the time. So she sent me to her, and I had a DEXA scan, and there was a few red flags that kind of showed up in the scan, and that kind of was a big red flag to me, and it kind of was like, okay, I need to do something here. But I found it, like, I was young at the time, I was still only 18, 19, to kind of come out of that cycle. So I kind of kept going. I was like, well, I have a season to run here. So I kind of kept going and didn't change anything. So I was like, well, I have to run my races. I can't change anything here. So I eventually then kind of educated myself. And I remember just speaking to other people like Jenny and just seeing the long-term effects of it. So that kind of scared me. Just to know about my bone health, reproductive health. And for me, I never wanted to quit athletics once I reached my peak. I want to run until I'm like 40, 50, 60. And I think that was the main thing for me that kind of was like, Sophie, okay, you need to do something here. So I just kind of took a step back from training, but it was actually quite hard at the time to just tell myself to cut down on training and increase, say, my food and calories, because like for me it was like, okay, I'm going to put on weight and I'm going to become slower. But initially at start that was fine, I think. It was hard, but I kind of knew it was for the good. And I think the main thing for like anyone, I think, is just your attitude and just kind of changing that attitude to, oh, I can be better if I kind of lose weight, eat less. But it's really like just slogging out and knowing that there's benefits in fueling yourself and there's long-term benefits here. And it's still something to this day I kind of have to tell myself like that, you have to fuel yourself. So when I do see the benefits of it now, I can go weeks and I can do blocks of training like consistently and I don't get tired. Compared to before, you'd be just kind of sleeping through the day. You might come home from work, you're like, well, I need a nap here again before I go training because I won't be able to get through it. So I think that's one of the biggest things now for me is just having energy for actual life outside running as well. So I think that's kind of the main things for me. And I think just being able to kind of speak to your coach and like about it and them like and not being in toxic environments. Like I am involved in university athletics now and I do see it quite a lot in training camps and stuff. And you kind of do feel like you want to fall back into habits of, well, that girl's eating this much and oh, maybe I shouldn't eat as much. But I think you just kind of have to like be in a mindset of knowing what's right for you and I need to fuel myself here. So I think that's kind of the main things for me. If there's any other questions from anyone else or yourself, Anna.
No, that's great, Sophie. Thank you very much for sharing. Can I ask you, Sharon, as well, just based on what Sophie said there, do you see a lot of maybe younger athletes or kind of younger women coming to you with that balance between eating and performance? Is that something that is quite common? Like you kind of mentioned there, Sophie, you were looking at losing weight to be faster. Like, is that something that is quite common among younger athletes?
Very common. And again, there's real positive reinforcement for that because when people lose weight, they generally do get faster. But that is a real boom and bust element of things because it's probably not sustainable in the long term. Listen, I mean, there are absolute freaks of nature out there and they can get away with whatever. But I think what we have to remember at younger ages, we have to build that resilience, particularly in bone health, because if that's not built through that real formative years of 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, then what happens is that kind of spirals into frequent injuries maybe later on in life, which is what you don't want as well. So, I mean, the resilience piece is really important. And listen, it's very hard to say to a youngster, as I'm sure, Sophie, you experience, listen, and I know people look at me and they go, are you actually mad? You're telling me to eat more and that will help me go faster. But the reality is, what I'm trying to say is that the training intensity and not losing any volume in that, and being able to go out week in, week out, week in, week out, not get injured, not get sick, and put in that same training volume, and not have some of these underlying parts of that soup mix being all over the place, for example, cortisol, that will actually get the returns that you want from your physicality rather than starving yourself. So that's the piece, but that takes time and it takes commitment. It takes grasping a nettle because everybody's telling you to do the opposite. You're seeing it, as you said, Sophie, you're watching others doing it and you're going, oh, I'm not 100% sure. And there's a voice in your head telling me, I think this is far too much. And what I would always say to counterbalance that with another voice is, what happens if it's not enough? So, I mean, I think your period started to give you the red flags. A lot of people will be told, oh, you're an athlete, that's normal. It's not normal. You know, it's your superpower. It's your body telling you things are slightly a little bit out of whack here. A normal menstrual cycle and a normal bleed gives us a really good barometer that we have a healthy, functioning hormone system. And that hormone system not only is important for reproductive health down the line, but it's actually really important for the physiological anabolic returns that you get from those hormones as well.
Just a question there as well. Something came up there, and it kind of prompted me, Sophie, as well, because I know you were on the Student Coaching Academy, so you have a bit of experience from coaching as well. So I suppose my question to both of you, actually, so if you're in a coaching situation, you may be coaching athletes, or even just kind of people who are taking part, not necessarily high performance athletes, and you maybe notice these red flags, or the girls are talking to you, what can you as a coach say? What's, a good kind of opening line, or how can you start that conversation with your athletes around this topic?
I think it's actually quite hard for the athlete to even open up the conversation. Like, I see it in our training group now. Our head coach is actually a male athlete or a male coach. But I notice myself, like, I'll just talk amongst the girls and I'll hear them saying like, oh, well, I haven't had my period in this long and I have niggles here. But when the coach comes to ask them, oh, how are you feeling? It's never down to anything else other than, oh, it's just something else. And the coach will just completely bypass it. Now, I'm not painting a flag for every coach. Now, every coach might have a different approach to it, but I still see it as something that's not brought up. Like, even after the last few years, I do see it as something that's a lot more in the media and stuff. And I do think I would like to see a change, but I just don't see it happening like yet. Now, I know myself, I'm quite open about it now with my coach. Like, I'll just straight out be like, look, I have my period, I have this. I will say it, I'm not afraid, but I think it comes from the coach and the athlete of not being afraid as well. I'm just kind of breaking down the barriers there to start.
Yeah. Sharon, how about you? You probably have experience from both sides.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's asking those questions, are you getting injured regularly? Has there been changes in your menstrual cycle? That's a powerful tool for monitoring. Why do you think that's the case? So again, you're asking them to reflect maybe on how they're feeling. Do you think you're getting value for money out of the training that you're doing? Are you seeing improvements, or has things gone a bit flat? Are you seeing consistency in your training? Are you getting sniffles or sore throats or colds more frequently? I mean, you're just not that unlucky. So these are, I mean, rather than saying, so it's almost reflecting back some of the things that they might be experiencing and then asking them to kind of question why that might be the case.
I think quite a lot of the time, as you say, Sophie, it can be both athlete and coach have that initial kind of unease around the conversation. So I think the more we can talk about it, the more people like yourself, Sophie, and obviously Sharon, you do a lot of work in this area, can make it a lot more of an easier conversation to have. That it'll help athletes kind of coming through, and coaches too, because I suppose we need to be able to have that conversation from a coach's point of view as well as an athlete's point of view. My final question for you, Sophie, I suppose if you've obviously been through this situation, if you were to give some advice to other other girls or other young women who are starting to train and starting to come into this area, what piece of advice would you maybe give them around training, around, you know, eating properly, that you wish you maybe would have known back in 2018?
I would say like just kind of knowing the long-term effects for me, like that was the biggest. Just it's not like performance within a few weeks. There's a whole life of sport there, like, and you have a life as well beyond that. And I think you need energy for life and you need energy for your sport. So I think that for me, like once I started to kind of have energy and have, you know, energy to do things, like that was the nicest thing to me, like just to see like, oh, I can enjoy life and I can be better at running. Not, I don't have to be sleeping all the time and tired and struggling through sessions.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. And then Sharon, finally, so just if there was a few kind of key takeaway points that you think would be good from this talk. I suppose we've got a mixture of kind of coaches and athletes on the call this evening. So what kind of 2 or 3 takeaway points from this conversation that you think would be useful for them to take away back to their club or their coaching group to kind of help them around this area?
I mean, I think that short-term process of trying to drop weight really quickly to try and get a result. I mean, yes, you might get a short-term result, but it's not sustainable. I mean, like that's the reality that we see. I also think that, you know, just sometimes when people's in the spiral, it's very hard for them to see out of it, because actually what happens is not only is there not enough fuel for the work that's being done, but there's not enough fuel for the brain either. And actually it's very hard for people to kind of they don't have the energy to actually make the decisions that they need to do. So being aware that some of your athletes aren't just being awkward, they actually don't have the wherewithal to do that. So sometimes a little bit of help around that, you know, reinforcing messages about where's your recovery, what have you had before you came to training, you know, look at the block of work that you have. If you're going to increase it as an athlete or a coach, make sure that they're fundamentally aware that once you increase that load, you need to step up on the field for that as well.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, well, thank you both very much. Thank you, Sharon, for taking the time to do that this evening. It was a really, really informative presentation, and hopefully everyone took something away from that. And thank you very much, Sophie, for sharing your story. Not always an easy thing to do, so I really appreciate you coming on and sharing that with everybody. Thank you, everyone, for your time this evening. And Sharon has shared her, or she will share her contact details through myself. If you have any questions afterwards or want to get in touch with Sharon, I have her contact details, so you can do it through myself or you can contact her directly through her website. So thank you all again, and we'll see you on the next one next week. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.